CEO mocked his black driver, went silent when her 10 languages saved his $2 billion company. The words hit like acid through silk. Do you even understand English properly, or should I speak slower? Richard Chun didn't look up from his phone as he spoke, his Italian loafers tapping impatiently against the Mercedes's leather seat. Outside, Chicago's financial district blurred past in a watercolor of glass and steel, but inside the car, the temperature had dropped to Arctic. Behind the wheel, Grace Williams kept her eyes fixed on Michigan Avenue traffic. Her hands, steady despite the knot tightening in her stomach, maintained their professional grip at 10 and 2. At 38 years old, she'd learned to swallow insults like bitter medicine, let them burn through her system without changing expression. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Chun," she replied, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd practiced it for exactly 18 months. "Then why," Richard's voice sharpened with the particular cruelty of a man who'd never been told no, "did you take the Michigan Avenue route when I said Lakeshore Drive?" Grace's jaw tightened. She'd taken Michigan because Richard's calendar showed an 8:30 meeting at Willis Tower, and Lakeshore added 12 minutes they didn't have. She'd been driving him long enough to know his schedule better than he did. But explaining would be interpreted as talking back, and talking back meant unemployment. "My apologies, sir. I'll remember for next time." "See that you do." Richard returned to his phone, dismissing her existence as easily as he'd acknowledged it. "I don't pay you to think. I pay you to drive and keep your opinions about routes, or anything else, to yourself." The partition button glowed on the center console, tempting. Grace had watched Richard use it countless times, sliding up the soundproof glass barrier whenever he wanted to pretend his driver wasn't human. Just furniture that happened to navigate traffic. But today, Richard wasn't raising the partition. Today, he was making a point. "Actually," he continued, and Grace recognized the tone. This wasn't just casual cruelty anymore. This was performance cruelty, the kind he practiced when he needed to feel powerful. "I've been meaning to talk to you about something." Grace's stomach dropped. In 18 months, conversations that started with "I've been meaning to talk" never ended well. "Your employment contract is up for renewal next month," Richard said, his voice carrying the detached interest of someone discussing weather. "I'm not sure we're going to continue the arrangement." The traffic light ahead turned yellow. Grace slowed smoothly, professionally, while her world tilted sideways. This job, with its barely adequate salary, was the thread holding her life together. Her mother's medication cost $800 monthly. The community college classes she took at night, inching toward the business degree she'd started 15 years ago, cost another $600. The tiny studio apartment in South Shore that she and her mother shared, $1,200. Without this job, the math stopped working. The careful budget she'd constructed like a house of cards would collapse. "May I ask why, sir?" "Why?" Richard's laugh was sharp, performative. "Because I need a driver who understands this is a professional position. Someone who doesn't constantly have their nose in books during downtime. Someone who looks the part." Grace's hands tightened on the wheel. The books Richard referenced were her textbooks, the ones she studied while waiting in parking garages during his endless meetings. And looks the part was code, the same code she'd heard in a dozen job interviews, from 100 microaggressions. "I've never been late, sir. I've never had an accident. I maintain the vehicle to specifications." "It's not about competence," Richard interrupted, his tone suggesting competence was the least interesting metric. "It's about fit. This is a reflection on me, do you understand? When clients see my driver, they make assumptions about my company's standards." The light turned green. Grace accelerated with a smooth precision that came from 18 months of practice, but inside, rage burned hot enough to melt steel. She wanted to pull over, walk away, let Richard Chun figure out how to navigate Chicago traffic himself. She wanted to tell him exactly what she thought of his standards, his assumptions, his casual cruelty wrapped in business language. But she couldn't. Because rage didn't pay for heart medication. Pride didn't cover tuition. Dignity was expensive, and Grace Williams had learned to spend it only when she could afford the cost. "I understand, sir," she said instead, the words tasting like ash. Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and Grace watched his expression change in the rearview mirror. Confidence drained away, replaced by something that looked almost like panic. "No, no, no," he muttered, frantically scrolling. Another call came through. He answered immediately. David, please tell me this isn't happening. Grace focused on the road, but in the enclosed space of the Mercedes, privacy was an illusion. What do you mean, all 3 services are unavailable? Richard's voice climbed toward genuine alarm. David, I have the most important meeting of my career in 90 minutes. 90 minutes. The Nakamura Holdings team, the Singh financial delegation, the Beijing tech representatives, they're all converging on our office, and you're telling me we have no interpreters. Grace's pulse quickened. In 18 months, she'd never heard Richard sound truly afraid. Angry, dismissive, arrogant, yes. But fear was new. I don't care if it costs $50,000, Richard was practically shouting now. Find someone who speaks Japanese, Mandarin, Hindi, and Korean. I need all 4. No, I need more than 4. The preliminary documents reference discussions in Arabic, Portuguese, and French. This is a $2 billion deal, David. $2 billion. Do you understand what happens to this company if we can't close it? $2 billion. Grace's hands remained steady, but her mind was racing. She'd been listening to Richard's phone calls for 18 months, hearing fragments of negotiations, technical discussions, strategic planning. She'd watched Chen Industries fight its way back from near bankruptcy after Richard's father's death, clawing toward this moment. Then postpone it. Richard barked into his phone. No, of course they won't reschedule. They've made it explicitly clear this is their only available window. If we miss this, they walk. Permanently. The desperation in Richard's voice was palpable now, filling the car like smoke. Grace could see his reflection in the mirror, a man watching his empire crumble in real time. Keep trying, Richard said finally, defeat creeping into his tone. Call everyone. Call people who know people. I don't care. Just find me interpreters who can handle multiple Asian and European languages by 10 a.m. He ended the call and sat in stunned silence. For the first time in 18 months, Grace felt something approaching sympathy. Then she remembered his words from 5 minutes ago, about her not looking the part, about ending her employment, and the sympathy evaporated. They were 2 blocks from Chen Industries headquarters when Richard's phone rang again. His face fell as he answered. Tell me you found someone. Anyone. His pause stretched long. I see. Yes. No, I understand. Keep me posted. He lowered the phone slowly. Through the mirror, Grace watched him realize he'd lost. The merger that would save his company, that would cement his reputation as something more than his father's disappointing son, was slipping away because of something as simple as language barriers. Grace pulled into the underground parking garage of Chen Industries' gleaming tower. She put the car in park and sat quietly, waiting for Richard to exit as he always did, without acknowledgement, without thanks, treating her like she was part of the vehicle's upholstery. But Richard didn't move. He sat in the back seat, staring at nothing, his phone loose in his hand. Mr. Chen. Grace ventured carefully. We've arrived. I know where we are, he snapped, but the venom was gone. He sounded hollow. Give me a minute. Grace waited, watching the seconds tick by on the dashboard clock. 8:47 a.m. Whatever meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m., Richard had 73 minutes to perform a miracle. And Grace Williams, the driver who didn't look the part, who would be fired next month, who'd spent 18 months being invisible, made a choice that would change both their lives forever. Mr. Chun, she said quietly, her heart hammering against her ribs. I speak 10 languages. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard's head turned slowly, his expression transforming from disbelief to confusion to something Grace couldn't quite identify. What did you just say? Grace took a breath, feeling like she was stepping off a cliff into empty air. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated or made invisible by someone who should have seen your worth, then subscribe to this channel, because what happened next would prove that sometimes the people we dismiss are exactly the ones we need most. Richard Chen stared at Grace through the rearview mirror like she'd just claimed to speak Martian. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again. You what? I speak 10 languages fluently, Grace repeated, her voice steadier than her hands. Japanese, Mandarin, Korean, Hindi, Arabic, Portuguese, French, German, Spanish, and English. Richard's face cycled through emotions too quickly to track. Disbelief. Suspicion. Something that might have been hope, quickly smothered by skepticism. "You're my driver," he said flatly, as if this simple fact negated the possibility of anything else being true. "Yes, sir. I'm also a person with skills beyond operating a vehicle." The sarcasm slipped out before Grace could stop it. 18 months of swallowed words, and this moment of vulnerability had cracked her filter. She watched Richard's expression harden, saw him retreating into the armor of his position. "I don't have time for games," he said coldly. "If this is some kind of joke." "It's not a joke, Mr. Chun." Grace turned in her seat to face him directly, breaking 18 months of careful invisibility. "You need interpreters. I am an interpreter. Or I was, before I became your driver." Richard's eyes narrowed. "If you're qualified to interpret for international business negotiations, why are you driving a car?" The question hung between them, loaded with all the assumptions Richard had made about her for a year and a half. Grace felt the familiar weight of having to justify her existence, to explain how circumstances and bad luck and systemic barriers had placed her behind this wheel instead of in a conference room where she belonged. "Because qualified people still need to eat, Mr. Chun. And interpretation work dried up during the pandemic. And when you're a black woman with a community college degree instead of an Ivy League pedigree, companies choose the candidates who look like what they think success should look like." The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. Richard flinched slightly, and Grace realized she'd just told her boss, who was about to fire her, exactly what she thought of people like him. "I don't believe you," Richard said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "You don't have to believe me," Grace replied. "But you have 70 minutes to find a solution, and I'm offering one." Richard's phone buzzed again. He glanced at it, his jaw tightening. Whatever message he'd just received wasn't good news. When he looked back at Grace, desperation was beginning to crack through his skepticism. "Prove it," he said abruptly. "Say something in Japanese. Something business appropriate." Grace took a breath, then spoke in fluid, formal Japanese. "Good morning, Mr. Nakamura. Chin Industries is deeply honored by your presence and grateful for this opportunity to discuss a partnership that would benefit both our organizations." Richard's eyes widened. The pronunciation was perfect, the grammar flawless, the tone precisely calibrated for high-level business negotiation. "Mandarin," he demanded. "Technical terms. Patent law." Grace switched seamlessly. The intellectual property transfer agreement requires careful consideration of existing patent conflicts and trademark protections across multiple jurisdictions. Richard sat back, his expression shifting from skepticism to something approaching wonder, then quickly hardening into resentment. Grace could read his thoughts as clearly as if he'd spoken them aloud. How dare she have been this capable while he treated her like she was barely competent to navigate traffic? "Where did you learn all this?" His voice was careful now, calculating. "My father was a UN translator," Grace said quietly. "I grew up in Geneva, Brussels, and New York, learning languages the way other kids learn to ride bikes. I got my certification in interpretation from Georgetown, worked for the State Department for 6 years, then went freelance when my mother got sick and I needed flexibility." She didn't mention the Georgetown degree was incomplete, that she dropped out in her final semester when her father died and the money ran out. She didn't mention the State Department job had been entry-level, not the prestigious positions reserved for people with the right connections. She didn't mention that went freelance meant lost steady income and health insurance. Richard absorbed this information, and Grace watched him recalibrate his entire understanding of who she was. But instead of shame or apology, she saw something else in his expression. Calculation. He was already figuring out how to use this, how to turn her unexpected value into his advantage. "Can you actually handle a negotiation of this magnitude?" he asked. "This isn't some tourist conversation. These are sophisticated business leaders discussing complex international agreements. If you make a mistake, if you misinterpret something critical, you could cost me everything." "I could," Grace agreed. "Or I could save your company. Your choice, Mr. Chen. But you're down to 68 minutes, and I don't see any other options walking through that garage." Richard's phone rang again. He answered without taking his eyes off Grace. "David, hold on." He covered the phone. "If I bring you into this meeting, if I trust you with this, you work for me. You follow my lead, you translate exactly what I say, nothing more, nothing less. Understood?" Grace felt her fingernails dig into her palms. The man who'd called her inadequate 30 minutes ago, who'd planned to fire her next month, was now dictating terms as if he were doing her a favor. Understood, she said, because pride was expensive and her mother's medication wasn't getting cheaper. But there's one condition. Richard's eyebrows shot up. Clearly, drivers didn't make conditions. If I save this deal, Grace continued, her voice steady, you don't fire me. You give me a real position in this company, with a real salary. Because I didn't spend 6 years at the State Department and 18 months invisible behind this wheel to go back to pretending I'm just your driver. The audacity of the demand hung in the air. Richard's expression went through several transformations before settling on something between annoyance and grudging respect. You're negotiating with me? Now. You taught me well, Mr. Chun. Everything has a price, and I just told you mine. For 3 long seconds, Richard said nothing. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh, but it wasn't entirely cruel either. Fine, he said. Save my company, and I'll give you a job worthy of your talents. Fail, and you're fired anyway. Deal. Deal. Richard returned to his phone. David, cancel the search. I found an interpreter. No, don't ask. Just make sure conference room A is prepared for the Nakamura team, room B for Sing Financial, and room C for Beijing Tech. We're doing this. He ended the call and looked at Grace with new intensity. We have 65 minutes. I need you to understand exactly what's at stake here. He pulled out his tablet, bringing up documents that Grace had never been allowed to see despite driving him to countless meetings about them. Chen Industries' financial projections. The terms of the proposed merger. The desperate reality of a company bleeding cash, kept alive only by Richard's father's reputation and rapidly depleting reserves. My father built this company from nothing, Richard said, his voice tight. 40 years of his life. When he died 2 years ago, everyone expected me to fail. Hell, I expected me to fail. This merger is my one chance to prove that his legacy didn't die with him. For the first time, Grace saw past Richard's cruelty to the fear underneath. He wasn't just arrogant. He was terrified. The Nakamura team controls the Japanese automotive supply chain we need, Richard continued. Sing Financial has the capital to fund our expansion. Beijing Tech has the patents we need to stay competitive. If all 3 parties agree to this merger, Chen Industries becomes one of the largest international trade facilitators in the Pacific Rim. If even one party walks away, the whole deal collapses, and we're bankrupt within 6 months. He looked at Grace directly, and she saw something she'd never seen in his eyes before. Vulnerability. 247 people work for this company, Richard said quietly. They have families, mortgages, kids in college. If I fail, they all lose everything. So yes, I'm desperate enough to trust my driver with the most important meeting of my life. But I need to know you can actually do this. Grace held his gaze. I can do this. But I need you to trust me completely in that room. When I tell you something about cultural context or linguistic nuance, you listen. These aren't just words I'm translating. They're relationships, respect, understanding. If you want this to work, you have to let me do my job. Richard nodded slowly. 63 minutes. What do I need to know? Grace smiled for the first time in 18 months while sitting in this car. First, we need to get me out of this driver's uniform and into something appropriate for a business interpreter. Then, I'm going to teach you how to greet Mr. Nakamura in a way that doesn't accidentally insult his ancestors. As they headed toward the elevator, Grace felt the weight of 18 months of invisibility beginning to lift. She had just over an hour to save a company that had never valued her, to prove herself to a man who'd never seen her, to claim the professional life she'd been forced to set aside. What Richard Chin didn't know yet was that Grace Williams had been preparing for this moment every single day she'd sat in that driver's seat, listening to his business calls, studying the companies he negotiated with, learning everything she could about a world she'd been shut out of. He'd called her inadequate. He was about to discover just how wrong he'd been. The executive bathroom on the 14th floor had never seen anyone like Grace Williams. She stood in front of the marble sink, staring at her reflection while Richard's assistant, Jennifer, hurried in with an armful of clothes. Mr. Chun said you needed professional attire immediately, Jennifer said breathlessly, her eyes filled with barely concealed curiosity. I grabbed everything from the company store that might fit. Grace selected a navy blazer and matching pencil skirt, simple pearl earrings, and low heels. As she changed, she could hear Jennifer on her phone in the hallway, the whispers already spreading through Chin Industries like wildfire. The driver speaks 10 languages. Richard's bringing her into the merger meeting. What's happening? When Grace emerged 8 minutes later, Jennifer actually stepped back. The transformation wasn't just clothes. It was posture, presence, the shedding of 18 months of forced invisibility. Grace Williams, the driver, had disappeared. In her place stood Grace Williams, the interpreter, and the difference was striking. Richard was waiting by the elevators, pacing like a caged animal. When he saw Grace, he stopped mid-stride. "You look different," he said, and Grace couldn't tell if it was a compliment or an observation. "I look like myself," she replied. "Shall we?" The elevator ride to the executive floor was thick with tension. Richard kept glancing at his watch. 9:37 a.m. 23 minutes until the Nakamura team arrived. 40 minutes until the full merger meeting. "Tell me about Nakamura," Grace said. "Not the business information. The personal details." Richard looked confused. "Why does that matter?" "Because in Japanese business culture, you're not just negotiating with a company. You're negotiating with a family." Mr. Nakamura's father founded the company in 1952. His grandfather was a craftsman who survived the Osaka bombings. Family honor isn't a metaphor for them, it's everything. Richard's expression shifted. "How do you know that?" "Because I've been listening to every phone call you've made for 18 months, Mr. Chun. I know that Mr. Nakamura's daughter just graduated from Waseda University. I know that Sing Financial's CEO lost her first husband in a factory accident and built her company from his insurance payout. I know that the Beijing tech representative, Mr. Wang, collects vintage motorcycles and quotes Confucius in casual conversation." Richard stopped walking. "You've been paying attention this whole time? Did you think I was just furniture?" Grace's voice carried an edge. "I've been studying your business, your partners, your competitors. I've been preparing for an opportunity one didn't even know would come. That's what invisible people do, Mr. Chun. We watch, we learn, and we wait." The elevator opened onto the executive floor, where David Kim, Richard's business partner, was waiting with barely controlled panic. "Richard, thank God. The Nakamura advance team just called from the lobby. They're early. 10 minutes early, and we still don't have," he stopped, seeing Grace. "Who is this?" "This is Grace Williams, our interpreter for today's negotiations," Richard said, his voice carrying an authority that surprised even him. David's face went through several expressions. "Richard, can I talk to you? Privately." They stepped aside, but Grace could hear every word. "That's your driver," David hissed. "You're trusting a $2 billion merger to your driver? She speaks 10 languages fluently and has State Department experience. She's qualified, David. She's a driver. What are the Japanese going to think when we show up with staff who were literally driving our car an hour ago? This is about appearances, credibility, respect." Grace felt the familiar weight of being discussed as if she weren't there, as if her presence didn't matter, as if 18 months of service had earned her nothing but skepticism. But then Richard surprised her. "The Japanese are going to think we employ talented people regardless of their current position," Richard said firmly. "Grace has more linguistic expertise than any service we could have hired. She stays." David opened his mouth to argue, but the elevator chimed. The doors opened, and 3 Japanese executives stepped out, led by a distinguished man in his 70s. Mr. Nakamura had arrived early, and there was no more time for debate. Grace stepped forward smoothly, bowing with the precise depth and duration appropriate for a business elder. When she spoke, her Japanese was flawless, formal, respectful. "Nakamura-sama, Chen Industries is deeply honored by your early arrival. We are grateful for your commitment to our partnership discussions. Please, allow us to escort you to the conference room where you can refresh yourselves before our meeting." Mr. Nakamura's eyes widened with genuine surprise and pleasure. He responded in rapid Japanese, his tone warming considerably. Grace translated for Richard. "Mr. Nakamura says he's impressed that Chen Industries has hired an interpreter who understands proper business formality. He notes that this attention to cultural respect bodes well for our partnership. Richard shot David a look that clearly said, "I told you so." As Grace led the Nakamura team to conference room A, she continued conversing in Japanese, asking politely about their flight, their accommodations, whether they needed anything. The executives relaxed visibly, their body language transforming from formal wariness to genuine comfort. "You did not mention you employed such a skilled cultural liaison," Mr. Nakamura said to Richard through Grace's translation. "This is a pleasant surprise." "Ms. Williams has been with Chen Industries for some time," Richard replied carefully, which was technically true. "We value her expertise highly." Grace caught the irony but kept her expression neutral. Value was a generous interpretation of 18 months of dismissal. The Singh financial delegation arrived 12 minutes later, led by CEO Priya Singh, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who commanded attention the moment she entered. Grace greeted her in Hindi, the formal business dialect used in Mumbai's financial district. Ms. Singh's eyebrows rose appreciatively. "You speak Hindi?" "Proper Hindi, not the terrible tourist attempts I usually hear." "Yes, ma'am," Grace replied in the same language. "I had the privilege of living in Delhi for 2 years during my interpretation training." "Finally," Ms. Singh said, switching to English. "Someone who understands that language matters. I once lost a $40 million contract because the interpreter translated strategic partnership as temporary arrangement." Words have weight. "They do indeed," Grace agreed. "Which is why I take them very seriously." Ms. Singh studied Grace with new interest. "You're the interpreter for today's meeting? Not the service we were told to expect." "Plans changed," Richard interjected smoothly. "We decided to use our in-house expertise." "Good choice," Ms. Singh said. "I'm already more comfortable." The Beijing tech representatives arrived exactly at 10 a.m., led by Mr. Wong, a precise man who nodded approvingly when Grace greeted him in Mandarin with the appropriate business formalities. As all 3 delegations settled into their respective conference rooms for preliminary discussions, Richard pulled Grace aside in the hallway. "You're making this look easy," he said quietly. "It is easy when you actually know what you're doing," Grace replied. "But the hard part is coming. Once we bring all 3 parties together, I'll be translating between multiple languages simultaneously while also managing cultural expectations. Japanese communication is indirect and context-heavy. Indian communication is direct and time-conscious. Chinese communication is layered with historical and philosophical references. If I don't balance all 3 perfectly, someone will feel disrespected, and this falls apart." Richard's confidence wavered. "Can you handle that?" Grace met his eyes. "I've been handling difficult situations for 18 months, Mr. Chun. This is just the first time you're noticing." At 10:15 a.m., the preliminary meetings concluded. David approached Richard, his earlier skepticism noticeably reduced. "The Nakamura team is extremely pleased with Grace's cultural awareness," he reported. Mr. Nakamura specifically asked if she would be handling all interpretation for future partnerships. He said, and I quote, "This is the first time an American company has shown us such respect." Richard nodded, but Grace saw something else in his expression. Not quite shame, but perhaps the beginning of recognition. For 18 months, he'd employed someone exceptional and never bothered to notice. Ms. Singh also asked about Grace, David continued. "Apparently, she mentioned a specific banking scandal that happened in Mumbai in 2019, and Ms. Singh was impressed that an American interpreter knew about it." "I pay attention to international financial news," Grace said simply. "It's part of being good at this job." At 10:30 a.m., all 3 delegations gathered in the main conference room, a massive space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Chicago's skyline. The seating arrangement alone was a diplomatic challenge. Nakamura needed the position of honor, Singh needed direct sightlines to all documents, Wong needed to face north according to feng shui principles. Grace had arranged everything perfectly, and as the executives took their seats, she noticed the subtle nods of approval from each team. Richard stood at the head of the table, with Grace positioned slightly behind him and to the left, the traditional interpreter's position. As he began his opening remarks, Grace translated simultaneously into Japanese for the Nakamura team, who wore translation headsets. But then Mr. Nakamura asked a question in Japanese that made Grace's heart race. Richard couldn't hear it through his own headset, but Grace understood immediately. The question wasn't about business. It was about trust. Mr. Chun, Grace translated carefully, Mr. Nakamura would like to know why you chose today to finally show Chin Industries respect for Japanese business culture. He's noting that your previous communications were handled by interpreters who made several cultural errors. Richard looked confused. What kind of errors? Grace took a breath. This was the moment. She could translate literally, which would expose 18 months of Richard's cultural ignorance. Or she could soften it, which would undermine her credibility with Nakamura. She chose truth. Your previous interpreters used casual Japanese language forms inappropriate for business elders. They failed to observe proper gift-giving protocols. They seated Mr. Nakamura's team in positions that Japanese culture considers disrespectful. Mr. Nakamura is essentially asking, why should he trust you now when you didn't respect him before? The conference room fell silent. Every executive from all three companies was watching Richard's reaction. David looked horrified. Richard's face flushed red. But instead of defensive anger, Richard surprised everyone, including Grace. Please tell Mr. Nakamura, Richard said slowly, that I am deeply ashamed of those previous errors. Tell him that I was ignorant of the proper cultural protocols, and that ignorance is my failure, not an excuse. Tell him that today represents not just a business merger, but my personal commitment to understanding and honoring the cultures of our partners. Grace translated, watching Mr. Nakamura's expression carefully. The elderly executive listened, then nodded slowly, a slight smile forming. Nakamura-san says, Grace translated back, that acknowledging one's mistakes is the first step toward wisdom. He appreciates your honesty and is willing to continue discussions. The meeting proceeded, but something had shifted. Richard was asking Grace questions not just about translation, but about cultural context. When Ms. Singh raised concerns about timeline ambiguities, Grace explained the Indian business perspective on punctuality versus the Japanese perspective on relationship building, helping Richard bridge both expectations. When Mr. Wong quoted Confucius regarding harmonious partnerships, Grace recognized the philosophical framework and helped Richard respond in kind, referencing Sun Tzu in a way that honored Chinese business philosophy. 3 hours into negotiations, during a break, Mr. Nakamura approached Grace directly, speaking in Japanese. You are not just an interpreter, he said. You are a cultural bridge. Your employer is fortunate to have you. Thank you, Nakamura-san, Grace replied. Though I should mention, until this morning, my employer didn't know I existed beyond driving his car. Nakamura's eyes widened, then he laughed softly. Perhaps today he is learning to see beyond surfaces. That is good. Men like Mr. Chun need such lessons. When the meeting resumed, the real crisis hit. Beijing Tech's patents, which were crucial to the merger, had a hidden conflict with existing Nakamura Holdings' intellectual property. The revelation threatened to derail everything. Mr. Wong was speaking rapidly in Mandarin, his tone becoming sharp. Ms. Singh was demanding clarity in English. Mr. Nakamura was asking pointed questions in Japanese. 3 languages, 3 perspectives, 3 different cultural frameworks for handling conflict, all colliding at once. And Richard Chun, for the first time in 18 months, looked at Grace Williams not as his driver, but as the only person in the room who could save him. Grace, he said quietly. I need you. Grace stepped forward, and in that moment, she wasn't invisible anymore. The conference room erupted into controlled chaos. Mr. Wong's technical team was pointing at patent documents, speaking rapid Mandarin peppered with legal terminology. Ms. Singh's lawyers were demanding clarification in English, their voices sharp with concern. Mr. Nakamura's executives whispered urgently in Japanese, their body language shifting from collaborative to defensive. Richard stood frozen, watching $2 billion evaporate in real time. Grace stepped into the center of the storm. Everyone please, she said in English, then repeated in Japanese and Mandarin. Her voice carried authority that made every person in the room turn toward her. I understand the concern about patent conflicts. But before we assume this is unsolvable, let me make sure everyone understands exactly what each party is saying. Cultural context matters here. She turned to Mr. Wong first, speaking in Mandarin. Mr. Wong, can you explain precisely which patents you believe conflict with Nakamura Holdings' existing intellectual property? Wong laid out the technical details in Mandarin. Grace listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated her understanding wasn't just linguistic, but technical. Then she turned to Nakamura's team, translating not just the words, but the intention. Nakamura-san, Beijing Tech has identified patents filed in 2019 that appear to overlap with your company's automotive sensor technology. However, Mr. Wong is asking if there's a possibility of cross-licensing rather than viewing this as a conflict. Nakamura's expression shifted from defensive to thoughtful. He responded in Japanese. Grace translated for the room. Mr. Nakamura notes that in Japanese business philosophy, apparent conflicts often become opportunities for deeper partnership. He's asking if we can explore collaborative solutions rather than viewing this as a barrier. Ms. Singh leaned forward. In Hindi we have a saying, she said, and Grace immediately translated it into both Japanese and Mandarin. Where two rivers meet, they don't fight for space. They create something larger than either could alone. The tension in the room began to shift. Grace facilitated the three-way discussion, translating technical specifications while also managing the cultural frameworks each party brought to the negotiation. When the Japanese executives expressed concerns indirectly, Grace made sure the Indian and Chinese teams understood the underlying message. When Ms. Singh's direct question seemed too aggressive for Japanese business customs, Grace softened the phrasing without losing the essential meaning. 2 hours later, they transformed a deal-breaking conflict into a three-way technology sharing agreement that actually strengthened the merger. As the final terms were being drafted, Mr. Nakamura requested a private conversation with Richard. Grace translated as the elderly executive spoke with unusual directness. "Chun-san, I must tell you something honestly. We were prepared to walk away from these negotiations today. Your previous communications showed disrespect for our culture that made us question whether a partnership was wise." Richard's face paled. "I didn't know." "That is precisely the problem," Nakamura continued through Grace's translation. "You didn't know, and you didn't care to learn. But today, because of Ms. Williams, you've shown us something different. You've shown us that your company can bridge cultures, can honor traditions, can see beyond American business assumptions." Nakamura paused, looking directly at Grace. "I want to offer Ms. Williams a position with Nakamura Holdings as our head of cultural relations for North America. Triple whatever Chin Industries is paying her." The offer hung in the air like a bomb. Richard's expression transformed from relief to something approaching panic. David, listening nearby, looked stunned. Grace felt her heart race. Triple her driver's salary would be life-changing. Her mother's medications, her unfinished degree, the financial stress that kept her awake every night, all of it could ease. But before she could respond, Ms. Singh spoke up from across the room. "Mr. Nakamura, with respect, Singh Financial would also like to make Ms. Williams an offer. Head of Linguistic Services for our Mumbai operations. We've been searching for someone with her expertise for 2 years." Mr. Wong, overhearing, approached the group. Beijing Tech would be interested in discussing opportunities as well. Someone who understands both technical specifications and cultural nuance is exceptionally rare. Grace stood in the center of attention from 3 international executives, each offering her opportunities she dreamed about for years. And Richard Chun, the man who'd called her inadequate that morning, who'd planned to fire her next month, who'd never bothered to learn her full name in 18 months, was watching her decide his fate. "Gentlemen, Ms. Singh," Grace said carefully. "I'm deeply honored by these offers. But before I can consider them, I need to have a conversation with Mr. Chun. Would you excuse us for a moment?" The executives nodded, returning to their teams. Grace walked toward the conference room windows, and Richard followed, his expression unreadable. "You're going to take one of those jobs," he said. "It wasn't a question." "This morning, you were going to fire me," Grace replied. "You told me I didn't look the part. That I was inadequate. That you needed someone who reflected your company's standards. So why should I stay?" Richard flinched. "I was wrong. Obviously, I was catastrophically wrong." "Wrong about what, specifically?" Grace pressed. "Wrong that I'm talented? Or wrong that you got caught being ignorant?" The bluntness made Richard step back, but Grace wasn't finished. 18 months of swallowed words were rising like a tide. "For a year and a half, I've been invisible to you. I've listened to your business calls, driven you to your meetings, maintained your vehicle, studied your company, and learned everything I could about the business you're running. Not once did you ask my name. Not once did you ask about my background. Not once did you see me as anything more than furniture that happened to navigate traffic. Grace. I'm not finished, she cut him off. You know what the saddest part is? I wasn't hiding my abilities. I studied my textbooks during your meetings. I made calls in multiple languages when I thought you weren't paying attention. I gave you every opportunity to notice that I was more than what you assumed I was. You just never bothered to look. Richard's carefully maintained composure cracked. You're right. You're absolutely right, and I have no excuse. I judged you based on your position, your appearance, my own arrogant assumptions about who could be valuable to my company. He ran his hand through his hair, looking genuinely shaken. My father used to tell me that the mark of a good leader is recognizing talent wherever it exists. I thought I understood that. But I didn't. I saw what I expected to see, and I nearly destroyed my company because of it. Nearly destroyed? Grace raised an eyebrow. You did destroy your company. I just rebuilt it in the last 6 hours. Which is why I'm asking you not to leave. Richard met her eyes directly. Not because I deserve your loyalty. I don't. But because I'm finally ready to see you, to value you, to give you the position you should have had from the beginning. Grace waited, letting him feel the weight of the silence. I'm offering you Director of International Relations, Richard said. Salary of $180,000. Full benefits. Equity in the company. Your own team. And most importantly, my commitment that Chen Industries will never again overlook talent because of my ignorance. Grace considered the offer. It was substantial, more than she'd imagined this morning. But the other offers were comparable, maybe better. And they came from companies that hadn't spent 18 months treating her as invisible. Why should I believe you've actually changed? She asked. This morning, I was disposable. Now I'm valuable. What's different except that you got caught needing me? Richard nodded slowly. Fair question. Here's the truth. I can't prove I've changed in 6 hours. I can only commit to being different going forward. But I can tell you this. Watching you in that conference room, seeing you bridge cultures and save deals and command respect from executives who've been in business longer than I've been alive, I realized something. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I didn't just fail to see your value. I failed to see my own ignorance. And that's cost me more than just this merger. It's cost me the chance to learn from you for 18 months. That's time I can never get back. Grace felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not yet. But perhaps the possibility of it. If I stay, she said slowly, things change. Completely. I'm not your driver anymore. I'm not your employee who takes orders without question. I'm your colleague, your expert, your reality check when you're about to make culturally ignorant decisions. Agreed, Richard said immediately. And we address the systemic issues. How many other talented people work for Chen Industries in positions that don't reflect their abilities? How many assumptions are you making company-wide about who's qualified and who's not? Richard absorbed this. You want to audit the entire company. I want to transform it, Grace corrected. I want Chen Industries to be the company where talent is recognized regardless of where it starts. Where people like me don't have to spend 18 months invisible before someone finally notices. For a long moment, Richard said nothing. Then, unexpectedly, he extended his hand. Partner, he offered. Grace looked at his hand, thinking about the morning's humiliation, the 18 months of dismissal, the casual cruelty of a man who'd never bothered to see her humanity. She thought about walking away, taking one of the other offers, leaving Richard Chun to learn his lesson the hard way. But she also thought about the 247 employees Richard had mentioned that morning, the people whose jobs depended on this merger. She thought about the opportunity to transform a company from the inside, to create change that would benefit people beyond just herself. Not partner, Grace said finally. Partners implies equality we haven't earned yet. But colleagues? Colleagues who challenge each other, who demand better, who commit to seeing people as they actually are. She took his hand. That I can do. The handshake was firm, professional, and witnessed by 3 delegations who just learned that Chen Industries had been hiding exceptional talent in its parking garage. As they returned to finalize the merger documents, Mr. Nakamura approached Grace one final time. You decided to stay, he observed in Japanese. I did, Grace replied in the same language. Why? Our offer was more generous. Grace smiled. Because the hardest transformations happen from the inside. And because Mr. Chun just got the education of his lifetime. I want to see what he does with it. Nakamura nodded approvingly. Wisdom and compassion. You will go far, Ms. Williams. At 5:47 p.m., after 9 hours of negotiation, the merger documents were signed. Chen Industries, Nakamura Holdings, Sing Financial, and Beijing Tech were now partners in a $2 billion enterprise. As the executives celebrated, Richard found Grace reviewing the final contract terms. Thank you, he said simply. For everything. But especially for not giving up on me when you had every reason to. Grace looked up from the documents. Don't thank me yet, Mr. Chun. Starting tomorrow, I'm going to make your life very difficult. Every assumption you make, every bias you carry, every moment you forget to see people as they are, I'm going to call it out. Richard laughed, and for the first time, it sounded genuine. I'm looking forward to it, Director Williams. 6 months later, Grace Williams stood in her corner office on the 28th floor of Chen Industries, overlooking the same Chicago skyline she'd watched through a windshield for 18 months. The view was identical. Everything else had changed. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. Just picked up my medication. No copay this time. Your insurance is amazing, baby. So proud of you. Grace smiled, remembering the panic of rationing pills, of choosing between her mother's health and her own education. Those days felt like a lifetime ago, though the memory kept her grounded. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Jennifer, who'd gone from Richard's assistant to Grace's chief of staff, poked her head in. Director Williams, the new hire orientation is starting in 5 minutes. Mr. Chen asked if you'd do the welcome address. Grace gathered her notes and headed to the conference room where 30 new employees waited, their faces bright with the nervous excitement of first days. She scanned the room, noting the diversity that hadn't existed 6 months ago. Different races, different ages, different backgrounds. Chen Industries was beginning to look like the world it served. Richard was already there, and when Grace entered, he stood, gesturing for her to take the lead position. 6 months ago, such deference would have been unthinkable. Now it was routine. Welcome to Chen Industries, Grace began. I'm Grace Williams, Director of International Relations and Cultural Integration. 6 months ago, I was Mr. Chen's driver. Today, I'm his colleague. That's not just my story. That's the story we're trying to write for this entire company. She saw several new hires exchange surprised glances. We believe talent exists everywhere, Grace continued. In parking garages, in mailrooms, in positions that don't reflect people's full capabilities. Our job, starting today, is to recognize that talent wherever it lives and create opportunities for it to grow. After the orientation, Grace and Richard walked back toward their offices together, a routine that had developed over the months. No longer boss and driver. Not quite equals, but colleagues learning to challenge each other honestly. The Nakamura partnership is exceeding projections by 40%, Richard reported. Mr. Nakamura specifically credited your cultural liaison work. He's recommending us to 3 other Japanese firms. And the Sing Financial expansion? Ms. Singh wants you in Mumbai next month. She's building a new training program for cultural competency and wants Chen Industries model as the foundation. Grace nodded, making a mental note. 6 months ago, she'd been afraid of losing her barely adequate salary. Now she was turning down international consulting offers because she couldn't fit them all into her schedule. They passed the employee break room, where Grace noticed something that made her stop. Maria Gonzalez, who'd been hired as a receptionist 3 months ago, was speaking animatedly in what sounded like Mandarin to one of the Beijing Tech liaisons. Grace stepped inside. Maria, I didn't know you spoke Mandarin. Maria looked up, slightly embarrassed. Oh yes. I lived in Shanghai for 2 years. I didn't mention it in my interview because, well, I was applying for reception, not translation work. Grace and Richard exchanged a look. Maria, Grace said gently, what if I told you we have an opening in our Asia-Pacific Communications Division? Would you be interested? Maria's eyes widened. Seriously? But I've only been here 3 months. Talent doesn't wait for seniority, Richard said, echoing words Grace had taught him. If you're qualified and interested, the position is yours to interview for. After Maria left, practically floating with excitement, Richard turned to Grace. How many more are there? People working in positions below their capabilities. We're still finding them, Grace admitted. Last week, I discovered that one of our janitors has a master's degree in environmental engineering. He's now consulting on our sustainability initiatives. Richard shook his head, but he was smiling. You're transforming this entire company. We're transforming it, Grace corrected. I couldn't do this without your support. My support. Richard laughed. Grace, you're doing this despite me, not because of me. I'm just trying to keep up. They reached Richard's office, where David Kim was waiting with quarterly reports. David, who'd questioned Grace's credibility 6 months ago, now greeted her with genuine warmth. Grace, the diversity recruitment initiative you proposed? We're seeing a 300% increase in qualified applicants. People want to work for a company that actually sees them. The afternoon brought a visitor Grace hadn't expected. Mr. Nakamura himself, in Chicago for other business, had asked to stop by Chen Industries specifically to see her. William-san, he greeted her in Japanese, bowing with the respect reserved for honored colleagues. I wanted to thank you personally. The partnership between our companies has exceeded all expectations. The honor is mine, Nakamura-san, Grace replied in the same language. But I also wanted to tell you something, Nakamura continued. In 40 years of international business, I have never seen someone transform a company's culture so completely. You have done more than facilitate a merger. You have taught an American corporation how to see the world. He handed her a small wrapped package. Inside was an antique business card case, clearly a family heirloom. This belonged to my father, Nakamura explained. He believed that true success comes not from what we achieve, but from how we help others achieve. You embody that principle. Grace felt tears threatening. Nakamura-san, I can't accept something so precious. You must, he insisted gently. Because you will pass it forward someday, to someone else who needs to be seen. That is how change spreads. One person at a time. That evening, Grace drove home to the new apartment she'd rented in Lincoln Park, a far cry from the tiny studio in South Shore. Her mother was visiting for the week, and Grace had taken time off to simply be together, without the constant stress of financial survival. Her mother was cooking dinner when Grace arrived, the apartment filled with familiar sense of home. How was work, baby? Exhausting and wonderful, Grace said honestly. She told her mother about Maria, about the new hires, about Nakamura's gift. Her mother listened, then pulled Grace into a tight hug. Your father would be so proud. He always said you had a gift for languages, but it's more than that. You have a gift for seeing people, really seeing them. That's rarer than any language skill. After dinner, Grace sat at her desk, looking at the framed photograph she'd placed there. Grace at 22, fresh-faced and hopeful, standing with her father at her Georgetown graduation ceremony, months before he died and her world fell apart. Next to it, she placed a photo from last week, Grace standing with the 30 new hires, all of them smiling, all of them seen. Her laptop chimed with an email. It was from Richard, sent to the entire company. Today marks 6 months since Grace Williams joined our leadership team. In that time, she has transformed not just our international partnerships, but our fundamental understanding of what talent looks like and where it lives. I'm writing to announce the Grace Williams Fellowship Program, a company-wide initiative to identify and promote employees whose capabilities exceed their current positions. Because Grace taught us all a lesson I should have learned long ago. The people we overlook are often the ones we need most. Grace's phone rang. It was Richard. Did you see the email? He asked. I'm reading it now. Richard, you didn't have to do this. Yes, I did. Because it's not enough for me to change. The whole company needs to change. Every company needs to change. Grace heard the sincerity in his voice, the transformation that had started 6 months ago in a parking garage and continued every day since. Thank you, she said simply, for being willing to learn. Thank you for being patient enough to teach me. After hanging up, Grace opened her journal, something she'd started keeping after her promotion. She wrote about the day's events, About Maria and Nakamura and the new hires who reminded her of herself 6 months ago, invisible and hoping to be seen. Then she wrote something else, a note to her future self. Remember the parking garage. Remember the humiliation, the dismissal, the 18 months of invisibility. Not to hold on to anger, but to remember why this work matters. Every person who feels unseen, every talent that goes unrecognized, every opportunity denied because someone couldn't see past their own assumptions, that's why you're here. That's why you stayed. That's why you keep pushing for change even when it's difficult. The world is full of people like you were. People with gifts the world doesn't see yet. People waiting for someone to notice, to care, to offer a chance. Be that person for them. Be what Richard became for you, but be it from the beginning, not as a last resort. And remember, you're not special because you speak 10 languages. You're special because you refuse to let someone else's blindness define your worth. That's the lesson. That's what matters. Grace closed the journal and looked out her window at the Chicago skyline, the same view she'd seen from behind a steering wheel, now seen from a corner office. The city hadn't changed. But her place in it had transformed completely. Her phone buzzed one final time. A text from an unknown number. Ms. Williams, my name is Diana Torres. I work in your building's mailroom. I heard about what happened to you, and I wanted to reach out. I have a degree in international law from Mexico City, but I've been sorting mail for 2 years because no one would recognize my credentials. I don't know if you can help, but I thought I should try. Thank you for giving people like me hope. Grace smiled, her fingers already typing a response. Diana, please come to my office tomorrow at 9 a.m. Let's talk about your future at Chen Industries. Talent doesn't belong in the mailroom any more than it belonged behind a steering wheel. She looked once more at Nakamura's gift, the antique business card case that represented a legacy of seeing beyond surfaces. Someday, she would pass it forward to someone else who needed to be seen. But today, she would use the lessons it represented to transform another life, to open another door, to prove once again that the people we dismiss are often the ones we need most. The city lights glimmered in the darkness, each one representing a person with dreams, with talents, with capabilities waiting to be recognized. Grace Williams had been invisible for 18 months. Now, she was making sure others wouldn't have to wait nearly as long. If this story moved you, if you've ever felt invisible or underestimated, if you believe that talent exists everywhere waiting to be seen, then subscribe to this channel and share this story. Because change doesn't happen when one person gets recognized. It happens when one person's recognition becomes a movement, when one open door becomes 1,000 open doors, when one act of seeing transforms into a culture of truly valuing every person's worth. Grace Williams started as a driver. But she became something far more important, living proof that the people we overlook are often the ones with the power to change everything.